It's the end of an ordinary Tuesday in late January. In a quiet neighborhood in Duxbury, Massachusetts, Patrick Clancy is wrapping up the kind of day that thousands of parents experience every single day. He and his wife Lindsay have spent the day juggling work, doctor's appointments, 3 young children, and the endless tasks that come with raising a family. It's a busy life, sometimes a hectic one, but it's also the kind of life that so many young families dream about. Their home is the kind where toys seem to spill into every room, children's artwork covers the walls, and someone is always asking for another snack. That morning, Lindsay had taken Cora to a pediatrician's appointment while Patrick stayed home with Dawson and Callan. And when they got home, Patrick headed downstairs to the home office he had built in the basement, while Lindsay bundled the kids into their winter clothes and took them outside to play in the snow. As dinner time rolled around, she found a local restaurant and called in a takeout order, asking Patrick to go pick that up and stop by CVS on the way. Just after 5 o'clock, Patrick grabbed his keys and headed out the door. About 45 minutes later, he pulled back into the driveway carrying 2 bags. He expected to walk back into the familiar chaos that comes with 3 children under the age of 6. But instead, the house was silent. He called out for Lindsay and the kids, but there was no answer. That's when he walked upstairs and noticed the door to the primary bedroom was locked. Using one of the small emergency keys, he unlocked it and stepped inside. He would later tell the jury he only made it a couple of steps before he froze. There was blood, a lot of it. A large pool covered the floor, and there was blood sprayed across the room. The bedroom window stood open, letting the cold January air rush inside. Patrick immediately turned and ran through the house, out the back door and into the yard. And there, lying on the frozen ground beneath the bedroom window, was his wife. She was alive. As Patrick called for help, he asked Lindsay, "Where are the kids?" And her answer would change his life forever. This is the 13th Juror Podcast, where we unravel complex court cases, investigations, and true crime stories, from high-profile trials to the mysteries that still leave questions unanswered. We examine the facts, weigh the evidence, and explore the arguments shaping each story, just as the jurors do. I'm your host, Brandy Churchwell, and today's episode is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Lindsay Clancy, The Trial, Part 1. This week marked the beginning of what is undoubtedly one of the biggest and most highly anticipated criminal trials of the year. When Patrick Clancy returned home that January evening, he expected to find his wife and 3 young children waiting for him, ready to eat dinner and begin their nightly routines. But instead, he found his wife bloody and injured on the ground beneath their second-story bedroom window. When Patrick asked Lindsay where the kids were, she told him they were in the basement. Now, as first responders began treating Lindsay in the backyard, Patrick ran back into the house. What he found downstairs would become one of the most heartbreaking crime scenes Massachusetts has ever seen. 5-year-old Cora, 3-year-old Dawson, and 8-month-old Callan had each been strangled with exercise resistance bands. Patrick desperately tried to save them. Cora and Dawson died that evening. Callan was rushed to Boston Children's Hospital, where doctors fought to save his life for 3 days before he too succumbed to his injuries. One of the first things I think is important to understand is that this is not a typical murder trial. There are some facts that neither side disputes. On January 24th, 2023, after Patrick left to pick up dinner and stop at CVS, Lindsay took the children into the basement and killed them one by one before going upstairs, attempting to take her own life, and jumping from a second-story bedroom window. She survived, but suffered catastrophic spinal injuries that left her permanently paralyzed. The defense is not disputing that Lindsay caused the children's deaths, so this isn't a trial about who did it. Instead, this jury has been asked to answer a much more difficult question. Did Lindsay Clancy know what she was doing, and was she legally responsible for her actions at the moment that she killed her children? And that's what this entire trial comes down to. And to understand why that question is even being asked, we have to go back several months. According to testimony and court records, Lindsay had struggled with postpartum anxiety and depression after the birth of each of her 3 children, and those struggles seemed to intensify each time she prepared to return to work after maternity leave. Now, Lindsay loved being a labor and delivery nurse. In fact, Patrick testified that she loved her job so much that she named Cora after the very first baby that she helped deliver. But as much as she loved nursing, she struggled with the thought of having to leave her young children. After Cora and Dawson were born, she did eventually work through those feelings. But Patrick would later testify that after Callan was born, something felt fundamentally different. This wasn't the Lindsay that he knew. Over the next 4 months, Lindsay sought help repeatedly. She saw psychiatrists, psychiatric nurse practitioners, therapists, emergency room physicians, crisis clinicians, and participated in both inpatient and outpatient treatment. Her medications were changed over and over as doctors tried to find something that worked. She experienced profound insomnia, suicidal thoughts, intrusive thoughts, and increasingly frightening psychiatric symptoms. And that's where this case becomes so deeply divisive. For more than 3 years, people have debated what happened inside the Clancy home that January evening. Long before a jury was ever seated, many people had already reached their own conclusions. To some, Lindsay Clancy is a mother who carefully planned and carried out the murders of her children. And to others, she's a woman who experienced a catastrophic postpartum mental illness and was failed by the very medical system that she turned to for help. And now, after years of public debate, those questions have finally landed where they belong, in a courtroom. The prosecution says Lindsay knew exactly what she was doing. They argue that she intentionally sent Patrick out of the house, created the opportunity, murdered the children, and then attempted to take her own life to escape the consequences. The defense says that she was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, complicated by multiple medication changes, and was so detached from reality that she could no longer appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions. Now, those are the 2 stories that the jury will hear over the coming weeks. And while it's impossible to separate the law from the unimaginable tragedy at the center of this case, that's exactly what these 12 jurors have been asked to do. Over the next several weeks, we're going to follow this trial witness by witness, just as the jury experiences it. Now, this week, opening statements began, and prosecutors and defense attorneys stood before the jury for the very first time and painted 2 dramatically different pictures of the woman sitting at the defense table. Then, the jury heard from the person who knows Lindsay Clancy better than anyone else, her husband, Patrick. And when he took the stand, some of what he had to say wasn't what many people were expecting. We'll be right back. Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham began the Commonwealth's opening statement by making sure the jury understood exactly who this case was about. She didn't start by talking about Lindsay. She started with the children. She told jurors about 5-year-old Cora, who loved princesses and sparkly dresses. She told them how Cora tried to convince her preschool teachers that her name was Sophia because she loved the television show Sophia the First. She told them about 3-year-old Dawson, who was rambunctious and full of energy, obsessed with trucks, and had the cutest little raspy voice. And then there was baby Callan, just 8 months old, whose chunky cheeks and sweet smile could light up a room. Then Buckingham looked at the jury and said, "We are here because they are not." She acknowledged that the evidence in this case would be incredibly difficult to see and hear. She warned jurors that they would be shown heartbreaking photographs and would hear emotional testimony. And she also acknowledged that they would hear extensive evidence about Lindsay's mental health in the months leading up to the children's deaths. But she told the jury that the evidence will show that on January 24th, 2023, Lindsay Clancy knew exactly what she was doing. According to the Commonwealth, January 24th didn't begin as the day of a woman detached from reality. It began as an ordinary Tuesday. That morning, Lindsay got Cora dressed and took her to her annual appointment with the pediatrician. Patrick stayed home with Dawson and Callan. During the appointment, Lindsay chatted with the pediatrician about some stomach problems that Cora was having and accepted the recommendation to start her on children's Miralax. She was also texting back and forth with Patrick. Dawson had dressed himself completely that morning. It was his first time doing it all on his own, and he was so proud. Patrick snapped a picture and texted it to Lindsay, and then Lindsay took a picture of Cora from the doctor's office and sent it to Patrick. Typical parent stuff. Now, after the appointment, Lindsay and Cora returned home, where the family settled back into the normal rhythm of the afternoon. Patrick went downstairs to work in his home office while Lindsay put Callan down for a nap. Then she bundled the older children into their winter clothes and took them outside to play in the snow. They built a snowman together, snapped pictures, and just enjoyed the day. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, Buckingham told jurors that Lindsay picked up her phone and began making a series of searches that the Commonwealth believed were anything but ordinary. She first searched for children's Miralax, the medication that Cora's pediatrician had recommended earlier that day. Then she called the local CVS and spoke with the pharmacy manager, asking whether they had it in stock. Next, Buckingham said Lindsay searched for a nearby restaurant called 3V and pulled it up on Apple Maps to see how far away it was. The Clancys had eaten at 3V before, but according to the prosecution, it wasn't somewhere that they typically ordered takeout. In fact, they had never ordered takeout there. When they did order dinner, they usually chose restaurants closer to home, and this one was about 11 minutes away. Buckingham argued that that wasn't a coincidence. According to the Commonwealth, Lindsay wasn't simply just deciding what she wanted for dinner. She was figuring out how long Patrick would be out of the house. Not long after that, Lindsay told Patrick it had been a long day, and she didn't feel like cooking. She said that she wanted to order from 3V and asked if he would pick it up. And while he was out, she also asked him to stop by CVS and pick up the Miralax for Cora. At 5:10 that evening, Lindsay called the restaurant and placed the family's order. Just a few minutes later, Patrick grabbed his keys, kissed his family goodbye, and walked out the front door. His first stop was CVS. Surveillance video showed Patrick walking into the store and heading to the children's medication aisle. He spent several minutes looking for Miralax before calling Lindsay. She answered, but the conversation lasted only 14 seconds. Patrick would later testify that she sounded busy. He assumed that she was occupied with the children, maybe giving them baths or getting them ready for dinner, and he didn't think much of it at the time. After purchasing the medication, Patrick drove to 3V. Surveillance cameras captured him waiting for the order, scrolling on his phone until the food was ready. He picked it up and headed home, arriving just before 6 o'clock. In total, Patrick had been gone for about 45 minutes. According to Buckingham, that window of time was exactly what Lindsay intended to create. The prosecution alleges that after Patrick left, Lindsay brought the children downstairs to the finished basement. There, Buckingham said she killed them one by one using exercise resistance bands, leaving each band around the child's neck. Afterward, Buckingham told the jury that Lindsay walked back upstairs. She went into the kitchen, retrieved a knife, and carried it into the primary bedroom. She closed the bedroom door behind her and locked it. According to the Commonwealth, Lindsay then crushed pills from her prescription bottles and mixed them into a glass of lemonade before attempting to take her own life. Buckingham said she used the knife to slash her wrists and neck, moved the bed away from the bedroom window, and then opened the window and jumped from the second story, landing in the backyard below. Buckingham told jurors that these weren't the actions of someone acting randomly or without awareness. The Commonwealth says every decision Lindsay made that afternoon, from choosing the restaurant to sending Patrick on 2 separate errands, showed planning, purpose, and an understanding of exactly what she was doing. As Buckingham brought her opening statement to a close, she told jurors that this case is not about Lindsay Clancy sitting in the courtroom today. It's about the Lindsay Clancy who existed on January 24th, 2023. The Commonwealth told jurors they would hear evidence from family members, friends, co-workers, and medical providers who interacted with Lindsay in the days and weeks leading up to the children's deaths. According to Buckingham, those witnesses would describe a woman who was functioning in her daily life, She was talking with friends, caring for her children, making doctor's appointments, ordering dinner, and interacting normally with the people around her. Prosecutors acknowledged that Lindsay struggled with depression and anxiety, and they acknowledged that she sought treatment. But Buckingham argued that the evidence would show something very different than postpartum psychosis. She described Lindsay as someone who had always been an overachiever. She was meticulous, organized, someone who liked to control every detail of her life and her children's lives. According to the Commonwealth, after Callan was born and Patrick returned to work, that sense of control began slipping away. Buckingham argued that instead of fully engaging in treatment, Lindsay withheld information from her husband and some of her providers, sought out new doctors when she wasn't getting the answers she wanted, and looked for what prosecutors described as a quick fix rather than committing to long-term treatment. The Commonwealth's position is that this case is not a referendum on postpartum mental illness or on how women are treated by the healthcare system. Buckingham told jurors this case is about one woman, one afternoon, and one series of choices. According to the prosecution, Lindsay reached a point where she no longer wanted the life that she had built. Buckingham argued that she saw an opportunity to escape it and made the calculated decision to kill her children first, then attempted to end her own life before anyone could stop her. Then Buckingham reminded jurors of the legal question they had been sworn to answer. She told them that struggling with mental illness does not, by itself, relieve someone of criminal responsibility. The question isn't whether Lindsay suffered from mental illness. The question is whether she knew what she was doing and whether she could control her actions. And Buckingham left the jury with one final unmistakable message. She argued that Lindsay coldly executed Dawson, then Cora, and finally Callan. That she deliberately lured Patrick from the house, had both the opportunity and the time to carry out the murders, and then attempted to take her own life to escape the consequences. The Commonwealth's position could not have been clearer. They say that Lindsay Clancy knew exactly what she was doing. She knew it was wrong, and she should be held criminally responsible for it. We'll be right back. Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham said in her opening statements that this was not a referendum on women's health or postpartum mental illness. But defense attorney Kevin Reddington opened up by letting the jury know that he could not disagree more.
The government says that this is a situation, it's not a referendum on women's having babies and having postpartum psychosis, postpartum depression, but it sure as hell is.
The audio isn't the greatest, but in case you didn't catch it, Reddington said the prosecution was going to tell the jury that this case wasn't about postpartum mental illness. His response? It sure as hell is. From that moment on, it was clear that the jury wasn't simply going to hear two different interpretations of the evidence. They were going to hear two completely different explanations for how this tragedy happened. Where the prosecution described a calculated murderer, the defense described a woman whose mind had been unraveling for months. Where the Commonwealth argued January 24th was a carefully planned series of deliberate choices, Reddington told jurors that you couldn't understand what happened that day unless you understood everything that happened during the 4 months leading up to it. According to the defense, this wasn't the story of a selfish mother looking for an escape. It was a story of a woman who desperately wanted help, repeatedly asked for it, trusted the medical professionals treating her, and ultimately developed postpartum psychosis, a severe psychiatric illness that left her unable to distinguish reality from delusion. Reddington then explained what the defense believes went so catastrophically wrong. He acknowledged that Lindsay had been diagnosed with postpartum depression and anxiety after Callan's birth. But according to the defense, that wasn't the full picture. Reddington told jurors the evidence would show that Lindsay was actually suffering from an underlying bipolar disorder that went unrecognized. Because her providers believed they were treating postpartum depression, he argued they prescribed antidepressants that in someone with bipolar disorder can actually sometimes have the opposite of the intended effect. Reddington explained that antidepressants, when prescribed without a mood stabilizer to someone with bipolar disorder, can trigger mania, worsen manic symptoms, intensify insomnia, increase impulsivity, and even contribute to psychosis. And according to the defense, instead of helping Lindsay recover, her medications actually accelerated the very psychiatric crisis they were intended to treat. He told jurors they would hear expert testimony that Lindsay wasn't simply experiencing postpartum depression. According to the defense, she was descending into postpartum psychosis fueled by an undiagnosed bipolar disorder and repeated medication changes. Reddington said that after Callan was born, life initially seemed wonderful. Patrick was home at the time on paternity leave, and the family was adjusting to life with their new baby. And by all accounts, things were going really well. But in September of 2022, everything began to change. Lindsay started experiencing what appeared to be the postpartum depression and anxiety, but she was frightened by the way she was feeling, and according to the defense, she did exactly what people are encouraged to do when they're struggling. She asked for help, and then she kept asking. Reddington walked the jury through what he described as a relentless cycle of doctor's appointments, emergency room visits, therapy sessions, psychiatric evaluations, medication changes, and treatment programs. Lindsay saw obstetricians, psychiatric nurse practitioners, psychiatrists, therapists, crisis clinicians, emergency room physicians, and eventually participated in both inpatient and outpatient psychiatric treatment. It's a lot, y'all. And every time her symptoms changed or worsened, Reddington said she returned to her providers looking for answers. But instead of getting better, she continued to decline. The first prescription came in September when Lindsay was prescribed Zoloft, an antidepressant, although she didn't begin taking it immediately. When she finally started taking it in October, she quickly reported an adverse reaction, and she could not sleep. The very next day, she was prescribed Ativan for anxiety. Less than a week later, 3 additional prescriptions were written, including doubling her Ativan dosage and adding 2 more anxiety medications. Just 1 week later, the Ativan dosage was changed yet again. By the middle of November, Lindsay was in the emergency department because she was struggling so badly and she still couldn't sleep. As the weeks passed, the medications continued to change. According to the defense, Lindsay meticulously documented every medication she took, the exact time she took it, the dosage, and even the side effects that she experienced. Her journal entries became increasingly disturbing. And she felt emotionally numb, described feeling like a zombie, and would even sit on the couch rocking back and forth. Her internet searches reflected that same deterioration. She searched for ways to treat insomnia, what to do if she was having thoughts of killing herself, and even methods of suicide. On December 4th, she called a suicide hotline. The following day, she was evaluated by a crisis team. Less than a week later, she was back in the emergency department after telling her father that she wanted to end her own life. By New Year's Eve, Lindsay was admitted for inpatient psychiatric treatment. Even after her hospitalization, her medications continued to be adjusted over the next 3 weeks as she continued reporting worsening symptoms. In just 4 months, jurors heard that Lindsay had been prescribed and then taken off of one powerful psychiatric medication after another. There was Zoloft, Prozac, Remeron, Klonopin, Valium, Lamictal, Seroquel, Ambien, Ativan, and others. Medications were started, stopped, increased, decreased, and replaced, sometimes only days apart, as providers searched for something that would finally help. According to the defense, this wasn't a carefully stabilized treatment plan. It was constant trial and error, and throughout all of it, Reddington reminded the jury that Lindsay never stopped asking for help. When one medication didn't work, she went back. When her symptoms worsened, she went back. When she became frightened by what she was experiencing, she went back again. The defense's position is that this was not a woman hiding her illness. It was a woman desperately trying to survive it. And according to Reddington, despite all of those appointments, all of those prescriptions, the evaluations, the hospitalizations, and providers, not one person recognized just how sick Lindsay Clancy had become until it was far too late. Once opening statements laid the groundwork for where the prosecution was going with their story and where the defense was going with theirs, then it's time to call the first witness. Now, the Commonwealth's first witness was not an investigator or psychiatrist or a medical examiner. It was Patrick Clancy. For nearly 2 days, jurors heard from the man who built a life with Lindsay, watched her become a mother to their 3 children, and ultimately came home to a scene that no parent should ever have to witness. Patrick testified quietly, kind of matter-of-factly for much of the time, but there were moments when the weight of what he was describing definitely caught up to him and he became emotional on the stand. Patrick met Lindsay in May of 2013 through his cousin, who had been Lindsay's college roommate. They started dating that July, moved in together a couple of years later, bought their first home, and married in December of 2016. Together, they built the kind of life that they had always envisioned. Patrick worked in technology and eventually began working from home full-time. Lindsay was living out her dream of being a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. Their home in Duxbury revolved around their children. Patrick testified that nearly every room reflected that. Even the dining room. They didn't even have a dining room anymore. They had been using that as a playroom for the kids. Their artwork covered the walls, and the family schedule revolved completely around gymnastics and swim lessons and music classes, skiing, play dates, all of the things, everything with the kids. He described Lindsay as an incredibly devoted mother. She started reading to the children when they were just a few months old. She made up songs for them. And Cora loved the book Green Eggs and Ham, so Lindsay would surprise her by making green eggs and ham for breakfast. She took the kids to music classes, filled her social media with pictures of them, and, according to Patrick, just loved being their mom. Lindsay also loved being a nurse. Patrick testified that nursing wasn't just a job for her. It was what she had always wanted to do. But each time she had a baby, returning to work became increasingly more difficult. After Cora was born, she struggled with anxiety as maternity leave came to an end. And after Dawson's birth, it happened again. She had a hard time being separated from the children and eventually began seeing a therapist, though she wasn't prescribed psychiatric medication at that point. Then came Callan. Patrick said the summer of 2022 felt wonderful. He was home on 12 weeks of paternity leave, while Lindsay was home on 18 weeks of maternity leave. They spent the summer taking the kids to the beach, out on the boat, visiting friends, and simply enjoying life together. Looking back, Patrick said everything seemed normal. It wasn't until September, as Lindsay's return to work approached, that he noticed things beginning to change. She became increasingly anxious. She told him she didn't want to go back to work because it felt unnatural to be away from her newborn. And at first, Patrick thought it was similar to what she had experienced after the births of Cora and Dawson. He testified that he never believed she was sick enough to require involuntary hospitalization or anything like that. Instead, what he saw was a wife who seemed increasingly overwhelmed by the demands of caring for 3 young children and the thought of returning to work and having to leave them. So they adjusted their lives around her. Patrick had been working from home since 2020, so he came upstairs throughout the day to help with the children whenever he could, and they hired a nanny. Not because Lindsay couldn't care for the kids, but just to give her additional support and make the transition back to work easier. Eventually, when Lindsay never returned to work, they let the nanny go because Patrick said Lindsay was home anyway. But Lindsay wasn't getting any better. Patrick testified that she sought help over and over again. She started seeing psychiatrist Jennifer Tufts, and when those treatments weren't helping, she switched to a perinatal psychiatry practice. She saw nurse practitioner Julie Paul and then Rebecca Gelada, along with therapists and social workers, and every time one treatment failed, they looked for another. As the providers changed, so did the medications. Patrick told jurors that he began noticing more and more prescription bottles around the house. He even kept a bag of discontinued medications in his truck that he intended to dispose of because Lindsay's prescriptions were changing that often. He explained that many of the pill bottles that prosecutors showed the jury still contained most of the medication, not because Lindsay refused to take them, but because her doctors had already changed the treatment plan and moved her on to something else. Now, this testimony actually presented a very important moment in court because prosecutors had questioned Patrick about these medications and how few pills were gone from them. And the prosecutor even said at one point that there were a lot of pills prescribed, but not a lot taken. Now, it seemed in this moment like this was kind of an attempt to paint the picture of Lindsay not having taken enough of the medication to have these reactions that the defense is saying that she had. However, Patrick actually pushed back on this. He told the prosecutor that context here is important. The reason that there were still so many is because they were changing her medication so often, she never had time to finish any of the bottles. Now, throughout all of this, Patrick said that Lindsay meticulously tracked everything. She kept a handwritten medication diary in the kitchen where she recorded every dose, every time she took it, and every side effect that she experienced. Y'all, that diary became increasingly alarming. Jurors were shown pages in Lindsay's own handwriting. On one day, she says, horrible thoughts. The very next day, horrible intrusive thoughts. The day after that, horrible thoughts and no motivation. Patrick testified that she also began telling him about frightening intrusive thoughts that she had involving the children. She wasn't describing a plan or saying she was going to hurt them, but she described the thoughts themselves as disturbing and frightening. She worried that something terrible might happen to the children, and Patrick even asked whether she needed to be separated from them. But according to him, Lindsay told him no. And then moments later, she would be making the children lunch or playing with them as though nothing had happened. He testified that he never once saw Lindsay hurt any of the children. He said that no doctor ever instructed him not to leave them alone with her, and no provider ever warned him that Lindsay posed a danger to them. And Lindsay herself never told him that she intended to harm them. But as December progressed, Patrick described watching his wife deteriorate. She struggled with severe insomnia. She became increasingly depressed. She eventually began telling him that she was suicidal, and when she told her father that she wanted to die, Patrick took her to Massachusetts General Hospital. She later entered McLean Hospital for inpatient psychiatric treatment before being discharged after what Patrick testified was the standard 5-day stay. Despite the deterioration, Patrick testified that on January 24th, the day of the murders, Lindsay seemed to be having one of her best days. She seemed happy. She was playing with the kids. She wasn't talking about suicide. She wasn't talking about harming the children. There was none of that. There was nothing, Patrick said, that made him believe that anything terrible was about to happen. And that's what made the testimony that followed so difficult to hear. If Patrick's testimony up to this point had been about the family that they built together, it now shifted to the day that that family was destroyed. He walked through the events of that day, the doctor's appointment, playing in the snow, getting takeout, and then coming home to a quiet house. After he found Lindsay outside, he noticed deep cuts on her wrist and around her neck. He knelt beside her as she drifted in and out of consciousness, and the 911 dispatcher instructed him to apply pressure if necessary, but Patrick testified that he didn't believe it was needed at that moment. Lindsay told him she had tried to kill herself. Once first responders arrived, Patrick ran to the basement to check on his kids. But the 911 call continued recording. The courtroom was silent as prosecutors played Patrick's 911 call. The recording itself was not broadcast publicly, but everyone inside the courtroom listened as Patrick ran through his home. They heard his screams and his cries as one by one he found each of his children's bodies. While it played, Lindsay sat at the defense table with her head in her hands as she sobbed. At times, she held one of her attorney's hands. There were reports from the courtroom that there were a lot of people emotional hearing that call. Even the cameraman had tears in his eyes. The pain and the trauma of that moment is something I cannot even begin to imagine. Patrick told jurors that a few days after January 24th, Lindsay called him from the hospital. During that conversation, she didn't mention the kids directly, but instead, she told him about what she had experienced. Lindsay told Patrick that she heard a man's voice. It was a male voice that she had never heard before, saying it was her last chance. She had to kill the kids so that she could kill herself. And she took action. And with that, one of the most emotional and anticipated witnesses in the trial stepped down from the stand. We'll be right back. Patrick's testimony was incredibly important for multiple reasons. For the Commonwealth, it established the facts of what happened on January 24th. Patrick was the person who discovered the scene, found Lindsay outside after her jump, and located all 3 children in the basement. His testimony laid the foundation for much of the physical evidence that the jury would see throughout the trial. But beyond that, prosecutors also used Patrick's testimony to support their theory that Lindsay was capable of careful planning. Patrick described January 24th as one of Lindsay's best days. She appeared happy, played with the children, attended Cora's doctor's appointment, and never mentioned wanting to harm herself or the kids. To the prosecution, that wasn't evidence that she was getting better. It was evidence that she was functioning normally, interacting appropriately with her family, and capable of carrying out a plan without raising suspicion. His testimony also established the timeline the Commonwealth would rely on throughout the trial. Lindsay asking Patrick to pick up takeout, then adding the CVS stop, the brief phone call while he was at the pharmacy, and the approximately 45-minute window during which prosecutors say she carried out the murders before attempting to take her own life. For the defense, however, Patrick became perhaps their most powerful witness, even though he was called by the prosecution. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm saying the most powerful witness, and he's the only witness so far. But hear me out here. Nearly every major theme Kevin Reddington introduced during opening statements was reinforced through Patrick's testimony. Jurors heard that Lindsay repeatedly sought psychiatric treatment, saw numerous providers, participated in both inpatient and outpatient programs, carefully documented every medication and side effect, and desperately wanted to get better. Patrick testified that she never hid her illness from him. Instead, she constantly asked for help. And just as importantly, Patrick told jurors that no doctor ever instructed him not to leave Lindsay alone with the children or warned him that she posed any kind of danger to them. Although Lindsay disclosed frightening, intrusive thoughts, Patrick testified that she described those thoughts as disturbing, not something she intended to act upon. And even after those conversations, he watched her continue to lovingly care for the children, and he never once saw her harm them. For the defense, Patrick's testimony wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about convincing the jury that this tragedy was the culmination of a catastrophic mental health crisis, not the actions of a cold, calculating killer. Now, there were also 2 other very short witnesses that were called. It was the general manager that worked at CVS and the hostess at 3V. They both testified that the conversations they had with Lindsay that night seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. Now, as we wrap up the first few days of testimony, I think it's important to remember that we're still in the very early stages of this trial. So far, the jury has heard 2 dramatically different stories, and after hearing Patrick Clancy's testimony, it's easy to understand why this case has captured so much attention. His testimony gave the jury something neither side could provide in their opening statements. It gave them a glimpse into the family before January 24th. They heard about a husband who watched the woman he loved slowly change, about a mother who adored her children, and about the unimaginable moments that followed when he came home that evening. But Patrick's testimony only reinforced just how complicated this case is. In many ways, both sides walked away with evidence that they believe supports their theory. The prosecution highlighted a mother who appeared calm, organized, and capable of carrying out a plan without raising suspicion. The defense highlighted a woman who repeatedly sought treatment, cycled through medications, battled worsening symptoms, and whose own husband was never warned that she posed any kind of danger to her children. That tension is exactly what this trial is going to be about, And that's where this case really is just getting started. In the coming weeks, the jury will be hearing from the medical providers who treated Lindsay in the months leading up to January 24th. And they'll hear about the medications that she was prescribed, why those treatment decisions were made, and how her symptoms evolved over time. And that's what's going to be really, really interesting in this case, because I think that's really what's going to make or break it for each of the jurors. And eventually, they'll hear from expert witnesses on both sides who will battle over this central issue in this trial. Was Lindsay Clancy legally insane because of postpartum psychosis, or was she mentally ill, but still fully aware that what she was doing was wrong? That question will shape everything that comes next. This trial is just getting started, y'all, and we will be following every witness, every ruling, and every major development as this trial continues. And I'll be back next week to walk through all of it with you. My name is Brandy Churchwell, creator and host of the 13th Juror podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave a rating or review. It helps more listeners discover the podcast. And if you know someone who would find this case as fascinating as you did, share this episode with them. For additional episodes, case updates, and more information about the podcast, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com. The evidence has been presented, the arguments have been made, and now comes the same question faced by every juror. What do you believe? Thank you for listening.